Welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. This week we're thinking in Thought for the Week about when Jesus stills the storm for the disciples, and I've been thinking this week about how actually it is often adversity which binds a community, and in particular a church community, together and helps them to put aside their differences. There was one particular community in which I worked where there was such a lot of division going on. I actually did say to somebody once, I think if there was a tragedy in this place, that the community would gather together and that they would work together. But actually, obviously, I didn't want there actually to be a tragedy. But it's hard to know how to mobilise a community into that sort of action where things can be done together, where people can put aside their differences, where people can think about all the things which are common to them being more important than things which divide them. So it's difficult to think about how to do that in some communities, but maybe you've been part of a community which has been faced with some large adversity. I think of church communities where there's been a big problem with the building, or whether there's been a big pastoral issue or a tragedy where people have felt that they needed to support each other, and you see how that happens, that people do put aside their differences. One of the other things I've been thinking about this week is that in fact when you're on pilgrimage you are kind of manufacturing adversity, and I don't say that in a kind of false sort of sense. It's just that when people are travelling together, things go wrong. There is a certain level of adversity, even if the travel is actually quite a difficult thing, and that is one of the things that binds people together. People enjoy being together, and they kind of grow through having faced the adversities together. So this week, when we come to Thought for the Week, we're going to hear about Jesus and the disciples facing a storm, and how the disciples are changed by the way that Jesus reacts to that storm, how they are transformed by facing adversity and understanding that Jesus is stronger than the adversity which they face. Thought for the week this week is based on the lectionary reading for this week from Mark, in Mark 4 verses 35 onwards, where we hear the passage of Jesus stilling the storm. So it's quite a short passage, but it tells things we need to know and some things which we maybe didn't need to know. So Jesus has had a really busy day. He's with his disciples on the shore of Lake Galilee. He's exhausted with the crowds. He says, let's go over to the other side of the lake in the boat. So they get in the boat. Jesus has had such a busy day that he falls asleep. It says that he fell asleep on the cushion. Now, that intrigues me, but we'll come back to that later. And then there's this storm. This storm blows up, and it's really dangerous storm, and the disciples are really, really afraid. And they wake Jesus up and they say, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Do you not care that we are perishing? And then Jesus stands up and he stills the storm. He just says, peace, be still, to the storm. And then, once he'd already stilled the storm, he says to the disciples, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? You could have more faith. And then they wonder what it is, who Jesus is. What is it about Jesus? How has this person just been able to stop the storm? And there are various things that I love about this story. One of the things which I love about the story is the detail of the cushion. I don't really understand why they've put that in that. I keep on looking for more instructions about that. So if you know, please put in the comments why having the cushion there is important. I can tell that Jesus probably did need a cushion though. He was exhausted, he needed to sleep, he was asleep on the cushion. And then the disciples are really afraid. They are really, really afraid. So they say to him, Teacher, we're perishing. We are going to die. And the first thing that Jesus does is he doesn't rebuke them for their lack of faith at that point. He just stands up and stills the storm. He just stands up and stills the storm. So that's what he does. He stills the storm and then he challenges them. When their lives are no longer in danger, he then challenges them and said, was that something that we needed to be so anxious about? And it may be that your life at the moment is in that situation where you do need to be that anxious about your life, that you do need to be really concerned for your life. And the good news then is that as Christians we believe that God can intervene in that situation, and he may intervene in a completely unusual way that you're not expecting. And that's amazing, and sometimes that does happen for people. So if you're in a particularly terrible storm at the moment, then it may be that God will intervene in that very direct way. But when I think about church communities where I've worked and the things which people have got themselves really agitated about, really concerned about things, really upset about things, they're not things that were that terrible, that really warranted that amount of upset, that really needed that kind of agitation. You'll hear a little bit more about that in the Dibley moment, a kind of example, or a good example, I think, of something which happened to me once. But yes, if our life is in danger, Jesus has the power to stop the storm. But actually, is the situation that we're in a life-threatening storm or not? The Dibley moment for the week this week is something which happened to me at a church service which I went to, but I was not officiating at. I went along as a mourner to a funeral for somebody who I knew, and I sat very quietly at the back. I didn't want to kind of bring any attention to myself, and it was quite a strange funeral. There wasn't any music playing before the service. I thought that was a bit odd, and there were no service sheets. I was just given a hymn book which looked like it was already 40 years old, and so I was like, well, this is a bit strange. I'm not sure quite how to respond in this situation, because this isn't like the funerals that I take. I was already a vicar by then, so I was like, well, what is going on here? And I was hoping that the funeral was going to be a good funeral and not a terrible funeral, despite the fact it was very different from the funerals that I already took. And it was in a country parish, and just about the time the funeral was about to begin, the vicar stood up and said, the organist isn't here. We don't know where the organist is, and so we're just going to get on with it, because, you know, there are many worse things happening in the world than the organist not turning up. And I was awestruck, because if that had been me at that point, I would have been really upset. I would have been really panicking. I would have been quite anxious about it. But he was like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We'll just sing without the organist. We have the hymns, we have the hymn book. And you know, it was one of the best funerals that I've ever been to, because the vicar knew the person who had died really well, and it was great. It was a good lesson to me in both being calm and knowing what you can do something about and what you can't, and also in just really tailoring a funeral for a particular person. So yes, if the organist doesn't turn up for a funeral, well, worse things happen, and that's a really good thing to remember. We found out at the end of the service the vicar had been given a note which said, organist gone to the wrong church building for the funeral, because it was a group of rural churches, which, yeah, it happens. Well, that's it for the Dibley Diaries this week. I pray that you and your community have a really blessed week, and that the storms in your lives are stilled.